Here we are, in a strange way, unpredictably, conducting a study that we thought we were going to do in church, but doing it via the magic of modern technology instead. This is the fourth of 5 studies of words of Jesus uttered from the cross. And we'll get to the actual word in just a moment, but a little bit of catching up needs to happen first. I've come to this week's study in a strange sort of way. We're surrounded by anxiety, pressing fear almost, and, well, if you go to the supermarkets, you can see even panic because of the coronavirus threat that is afflicting all of us and challenging us day by day. It was thinking about that little crisis that led me to read verses in the Epistle to the Romans, which I'm going to read to you now. And it's just interesting that some problems we think are ours just for today, but they're as old as the hills, in fact. Just listen to St. Paul from 2,000 years ago. We know, he says, that the whole creation has been groaning with labor pains until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we groan inwardly while we keep on waiting. Well, isn't that just where we are? The whole of creation is groaning. There are translations of that passage that suggest it's a bit more than groaning. It's screaming with pain, and that seems to fit too. Well, that's how I started my thinking in readiness for this little communication. And then I remembered that there was a painting that had exactly that title. It was by a Norwegian painter called Edvard Munch. Now, I'm going to look to my screen to just remind myself. The Scream of Nature. There you are. That's what the painting was called. It later became called simply The Scream, and that's how we know it. It was done by this Norwegian painter in 1893. It's the face of a man that's contorted, and against a very violent natural background, you can almost sense the intensity of the sound coming out of that mouth, out of that face, out of the very being of that man. That's what we're talking about this week, the scream. So my thoughts began with nature, and the way nature was screaming, and the coronavirus, but it didn't take long for me to get to the subject of this talk, which is that word from the cross where Jesus utters a scream. We're going to look at that a little bit more carefully in a moment. This week's study is a crux. Now, I've chosen the word crux very, very carefully. It means a turning point. That's what a crux means, but it's a pun. It's a Latin word. Not only does it mean in English a turning point, the word means in Latin the cross. And I'm going to be looking at this moment in the study of what happened on the cross to show how the cross itself is a turning point, and how this week's word is the turning point in the drama that's unfolded on Calvary. So, all of that by way of introduction. And we're not quite ready yet even to get into the real meat of the subject, because now we must just catch up. It's very important that we don't forget the ground that we've trodden over in the last 3 weeks. We've considered 3 words from the cross, and all of the words, this is how I described them in the talks I gave, are outward-facing words. Jesus, with extraordinary poise, hanging on the cross that was to take his life from him, is still in command of himself and in touch with his instinctual feelings and everything that he's displayed in his lifetime, able to look outside himself and consider the plight and the future of the people around him. He's come to this moment via the most degrading series of events it's possible to imagine imposing on a single human being. I mean, the more you read it, and remember that this old man talking now has been over this ground for 60 years consecutively, hoping to get more and more deeply into what I recognize to be that the very heart of everything that Christianity is about. I'm still not there. I long for next year. I long to live long enough to do it 50 more times, because it is so vital. Well, the degradation included mockery, satire, humiliation, flogging, completely despicable treatment, being treated like an animal, carrying his own cross, subjected to fake trials, one after another, wearing a crown of thorns, a purple robe, I mean, you name it. One way of humiliating a man after another, hitting a man when he's down, a defenseless human being just being treated like a rag doll. So all of that has happened to this man as he gets onto this cross. And on this cross, he can still be putting forth the message that his entire life was about. I just find myself in awe at the possibilities, the capacity of this man to do that. Father, forgive them. Forgive them. Forgive them. If I were there, I'd want to kick them in the face. Forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. Today, truly, you'll be in paradise with me, he said to the thief alongside him on a nearby cross, because that man had shown, or seemed to show, and Jesus sensed it, an affinity with the true identity and the true nature of Jesus. And on the basis of that capacity of a thief, a convicted felon, to recognize who and what Jesus was, Jesus says, "You've done it, boy. You're there. You've made the leap. Paradise is where you'll land." I mean, it's a lovely, lovely story. And then the care that he gave to his mother and his friend, and the honoring of family and friendship in the context that he was in. And let's remember, it wasn't an easy thing to think about his friends. Just think, one of them had betrayed him, one of them had denied him, they'd all fled. I mean, friends? A friend in need is a friend indeed. Well, these friends, they certainly put space between themselves and Jesus, and off they went. So Jesus still considered, and his mother he'd not always sort of seen eye to eye with. He'd not allowed her to dominate the center of his teaching or his ministry. And here we are, therefore, seeing Jesus absolutely instinctually driven to want the well-being of his mother and his son. All of that has happened before we get to this crux. The scream of nature, the scream, Eloi, Eloi, lemi sabachthani. That's what it is in Aramaic or in Hebrew. And I'm not strong on either of those languages, let me tell you. But it means, my God, why have you forsaken me? There. I said it quite gently, didn't I? Why have you forsaken me? It didn't sound like that when he did it. No, it was a scream. Right, let's think about the scream. I want to look at two kinds of scream that I'm familiar with. The first one is, well, I guess that there are people who dying, rage against the dying of the light. That's what the poet said, Dylan Thomas, to his father as he was dying. Don't go quietly, Dad. Scream to stay. Hang on to life. I don't want you to go. I don't know whether the scream was from the poet asking his dad, or that he might have wanted his dad to scream. Whatever it is, there's the scream that is associated with the one who's dying. But there's also the scream, and boy, have I heard it again and again in all the years of my ministry, of the one who's just lost a loved one. There seems to be released in the heart, in the deepest being of someone who's desperately been supporting, wanting, praying, helping, a loved one to just go on living in the moment of defeat. There's something that comes from deep inside such a person, and boy, oh boy, it's heartrending. It just tears your guts to pieces. The one, that is, if you hear it, what it must be like for the one who screams it is entirely a different matter. And I believe that that's the kind of scream that came from Jesus as he let himself now be swallowed up, be absolutely taken in tow by death itself. A scream, Eloi, Eloi, lima sabachthani. Eloi, Eloi, lima sabachthani. Well, I'm getting there, but I'm nowhere near it. The intensity of the scream, that utter sense of pain at its pitch, with an inevitability that the end was near. I'm trying hard in the way I talk about the scream to give some idea of its intensity, of the depth within the person uttering the scream from which it came. It's as if it's everything that's in you comes out in one final burst, ear-splitting burst. And as I say, I have been witness to that in my own family and in my pastoral work down the years. But there's another scream too. There's another scream. And this is an entirely different one. Well, I started by reading those verses from Romans about the whole of nature having labor pains as it wants a new birth, freedom for the human race to come into being. And labor pains bring their own pain, and no doubt they bring their own shouting and screaming, but that's not what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking of that moment when the midwife takes the new baby in her arms, and having done what needs to be done to separate the baby from the mother, gives it a little slap on the back, and out comes a scream. And this scream, which comes from just as deep inside the person as the other scream, only this time the scream is from a baby who hasn't had a single thought yet, who doesn't know what life's about at all, who has no capacity to do or think anything. That scream brings smiles to the faces of all who hear it, for that is the scream of life. And so there's the scream that portends death, and there's the scream that promises life. And what I think about the cross where Jesus screams, an eviscerating scream, an ear-splitting scream, one that just fills one with despair for the poor thing as he lives his last minutes before it all ends. I want to suggest that that kind of a scream, and the scream of the baby starting his new life, since they have the same intensity, I believe, in this case, Jesus' scream is as much about the new birth that is the consequence of his death as it is of the death itself. Now, that's a difficult point to make, and I hope that I've been clear enough about the way it's all come about. Now, let me just say that once again, I'm trying to explore a dark moment. I'm trying to get inside the experience of Jesus. We can't do it, of course, it's always second-hand. But we're dealing with a story that's 2,000 years old, and we are familiar with it to our fingertips. We think we know it all, and yet do we? If we could only imaginatively get inside this experience, these last moments, minutes, hours of Jesus' life, I think we would be filled, A, with admiration, B, with respect, but C, with hope. Hope. For we're not dealing here with somebody who is giving in. We are we are dealing here with someone who's giving the burden over to the giver of life itself and is providing his contribution towards a new understanding of the human life as we can live it. Now, the other thing to say about this scream is that if anybody ever thought that Jesus was play acting, and let me tell you, there have been people who've done that, indeed in the scriptures itself. People can't cope with the fact, for example, that God, if we make claims for Jesus to be God, could grow up, could be born of a mother, could die. And so they've invented the story that we should only think about Jesus during the active years of his ministry. And this business of being born and growing up and dying have all been tacked on later just for the sake of completing a life story. If Jesus were seriously only the person we look at in the active years of his ministry, that is, if he was robbed of his childhood in the story and of his death, then I think it'd be much harder to believe in him. You want to believe that he's really human? That scream says it all. Now, there have been commentators who've suggested, for example, that what Jesus is doing on the cross is reciting, because he's a good Jew and he'd have known it by heart, he's reciting the first line of a psalm, Psalm 22. Just listen. My God, why have you forsaken me, says the psalmist. Why are you so far from helping me? From words of my groaning, oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. There, that's what was really happening. This is not the kind of scream that we associate with death and dying. It's Jesus taking consolation in the psalm that he knows by heart. And let it be said, let it be added, that that psalm, which begins so darkly, ends brilliantly. To him indeed shall all who sleep in the earth bow down. I shall live for him, posterity will serve him, so on, so on, and so on. Often these psalms that begin painfully end gloriously with a paean of praise to God our Maker. And so some people say that scream from the cross is a quotation from the Psalms, and this particular psalm ends well. Did you ever hear such rubbish in your life? Everybody trying to diminish and marginalize the pain, the agony that Jesus suffered on the cross. Water it down. He was God, wasn't he? He didn't have to go through all of that. Surely there were angels that could come and rescue him, as Satan said when at the beginning of the ministry, when the temptations took place. But it's not like that at all. If we believed that this was just a quotation from the Psalms to show how holy and learned in the scriptures Jesus was, if in any way we take away from Jesus the intensity of that pain that led to that scream, then I believe that it would be so much more difficult to believe in him. I can give Jesus my full allegiance as a human being because I can see in Jesus a fully human being. And nothing proves that more than the agony that he suffered on the cross. And the scream is the exhalation. It is the uttering of all that was human in Jesus, stretched to its breaking point. I can cope. Every other thing about Jesus that they say I can cope with, criticism and the rest of it, it will not challenge my belief that this man has been human to the last breath he drew. And therefore, when we look at the resurrection, as we shall look at the resurrection in due course, we will do it not as a miracle in the sense of being a piece of magic, but having defeated death itself, real death, the death that diminishes and ends all our biological lives, before we get subsumed into some greater reality. Jesus has trodden that path. He has been to the lowest point that any human being can go. The scream proves it. My God, why have you forsaken me? And out of that forsakenness will come blessing. After Friday will come Sunday, and the story becomes a different story altogether.